So today we're going to have a discussion concerning Indigenous women, and we're going to be dealing with issues of discrimination that are attached to membership and status and entitlement and ability to belong to communities. So this is a follow-up and a continuing on from the kind of violence that we talked about that was physically experienced by many Indigenous women, and then the violence that occurs in their property rights not being recognized on the reserves. And so this is a further part of that discussion. But before I went forward further with this, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize an amazing thing I discovered yesterday. I was at the University of Ottawa Law School, and I gave a talk there over lunch. And then afterwards, we went out for some food with colleagues there. We talk about things that professors talk about. We are too worried about how busy you are. We're worried about how busy we are. We're trying to think about ways to make the law school better. We talk about our kids. We just talk about life in general. But as the conversation unfolded, eventually we came to poetry, of all things. And there's a guy named Peter Oliver who teaches constitutional law at the University of Ottawa, who's very well known in the field, who said, there's this poet when I read that I just can't contain myself. Her name is Mary Oliver. And he referenced her because I was talking yesterday about this idea of a kinomagewin, where you look to nature, and from nature you try to draw analogies as to how you behave or how you shouldn't behave. And he was saying in her poetry, he recognized some of the things that I was trying to get at, as she would kind of go for walks in the woods, and in those walks in the woods, in her observations, try to draw out conclusions about what life means to her. And so since it's that time of year, getting close to exams, we need to pick up, I thought I'd just read a couple of these poems as encouragement to you to find things that you can do in your life over the next month that give you some sanity when life comes at you very quickly. So this first one, again, this is Mary Oliver, new and selected poems. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snap shut the purse, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy and singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth tending, as all music does, towards silence, and each body a line of courage and something precious to the earth. And when it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I've made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened and full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. And here's another one called The Sun. Have you ever seen anything in your life more wonderful than the way the sun every evening, relaxed and easy, floats towards the horizon and into the clouds or the hills or the rumpled sea and is gone, and how it slides again out of blackness every morning on the other side of the world like a red flower, streaming upward on its heavily oils, say on a morning in early summer at its perfect imperial distance? And have you ever felt for anything such wild love? Do you think there is anywhere in any language a word billowing enough for the pleasure that fills you as the sun reaches out as it warms you, as you stand there empty-handed? Or have you too turned from this world? Or have you too gone crazy for power, for things? one more. The Buddha's last instruction. Make of yourself a light, said the Buddha before he died. I think of this every morning as the east begins to tear off its many clouds of darkness, to send up the first sickle, a white fan streaked with pink and violet, even green. An old man, he lay down between two salad trees, and he might have said anything, knowing it was his final hour. The light burns upward, it thickens and settles over the field. Around him the villagers gather and stretch forward to listen. Even before the sun itself hangs disattached in the blue air, I'm touched everywhere by the ocean of its yellow waves. No doubt he thought of everything that happened in this difficult life. And then I feel the sun itself as it blazes over the hills, like a million flowers on fire. And clearly I'm not needed. And yet, I feel myself turning into something of inexplicable value. Slowly beneath the branches, he raised his head. He looked into the faces of that frightened crowd. So, Mary Oliver, or whatever wisdom, literature, or ways that you find to just get a grip on yourself as exams start to come into focus for you, it's important to take those moments and remember really what we're here for and put these things into perspective. It's also nice to be able to think about these more elevated thoughts as we then come to the law, and we see how the law in this instance is working to grind away and ground down so many people's abilities to feel a kind of sunshine and joy in embracing life. So we're going to be talking about the discrimination that has been a part of Indians' experiences since the 1850s. So we'll talk about the history of the Indian Act and how it's worked to excommunicate people from their communities, banish people from their communities, largely women. Then we'll look at attempts to challenge that in the law through the Bill of Rights in the 1970s, in the case called Laval and Bedard versus Canada. Unsuccessful in the attempts to find that the Indian Act was contrary to the Bill of Rights. The matter is then taken to the United Nations. And in the Lovelace case, we have another test of whether or not the status provisions of the Indian Act are violations of rights to sexual equality, violations of rights to a minority to be able to enjoy their culture. And in this case, we find the answer is the court, or the commission here, is not willing to find that the Indian Act provisions are denials of sexual equality because of the way the Act came into force, or so the optional protocols came into force after the Act was already in force. But the court does find that the denial of status, the commission finds, the denial of status is a denial of women's ability to be able to participate in their culture. So it severs them from that aspect of their community. Following history of the acts and these two cases, we'll then look at the role of activism, direct action, individual peoples, groups just stepping forward and trying to make a difference in the world. And we will see that does make a difference. Right? As I've been trying to say over and over again, law is not just what Parliament says, it's not just what the court says, it's also what people do and how they can act in the world to find reform. And so we'll look at some of the testimony of the women from the Tobique First Nation that were involved in this Lovelace case, which eventually, in addition to the Constitution being patriated, Section 15 coming into force, leads to some amendments to the Indian Act in 1985. And those amendments to the Indian Act resolved some of the discrimination that had been complained about in the Lovelace and in the Laval case. But it didn't resolve all of the discrimination. There was still residual discrimination. There was a part of the amendments from 1985, and so then you get the Mciver case. And the Mciver case tries to address that residual discrimination, and the court in first instance applies a very broad remedy to basically try to overturn any discrimination that Indigenous women ever experienced under the Indian Act. But then the Court of Appeal still accepts that there's discrimination, but it crafts a narrower remedy and doesn't allow for any discrimination that's ever been faced on the basis of sex to be remedied, but it takes a narrower class of remedial action. And so there are some possibilities that we see for reform here. And then if we get time, which we often don't get, there's Ganawage, there's continuing challenges concerning sexual discrimination, because it's not just now Parliament that's the problem or the courts that are the problem. People have lived with this for 140, 50 years, longer. And so within communities, we have sexual discrimination being propagated by different communities, in some cases by advancing tradition as an argument to be able to forward that way of being in the world. So that's the whole lecture in kind of 5 minutes there on this slide. And now we're going to just pick this apart and deconstruct, look at it in more particulars. So first of all, Indian Act history. As you read in the materials, in the 1850s was the first attempt by the federal government to deal with matters of Indian status. Before the 1850s, the Indian affairs was often administered by the military because Indigenous peoples were apart, kind of nation to nation. But after the War of 1812 and the period, the Canadas coming together, Indians fell under the civilian wing of governments in Canada. And with coming under the civilian governments, they then started to deal with the internal affairs of the Indians. Before that, they wouldn't have dared to do that when the military was working. And so this 1850 Act for the better protection of the lands and property of the Indians in Lower Canada had a quite inclusive definition of Indian status. It included all those of Indian blood and their descendants. It included non-Indians who were married into the community and living with Indians on their designated lands. It even included people who were adopted in infancy by Indians. Right? So it wasn't a racialized thing. It was a political thing. It was a family status. Everyone who associated in that kinship, in that political space on the land could be considered Indians. But in 1851, the definition, 1 year after this, became more restrictive as it denied non-Indian men who married Indian women the right to acquire status. And so we now see there's some now distinctions being made on the basis of sex, but still all the children of these marriages could be considered Indians, whether or not they had this one non-Indian father in the line of their ancestry. So that's 1850. 1857, you get a switch, quite dramatic. It's there in the title, an act to encourage the gradual civilization of Indian tribes in the province and to amend the laws respecting Indians. This provision, this act, created provisions for the enfranchisement of Indians, as the term was used by the legislature, meaning that these people would be enfranchised into more general status of citizenship in the Canadas at that time. It applied only to adult male Indians over the age of 21 who were able to read and write either English and French, who were reasonably well educated, free of debt, and of a good moral character as determined by a commissioner of examiners. So this determining of franchise here was something that was done by an external body, and if this male over 21 met these criteria, his wife and his children would automatically be enfranchised along with him, which accords with the Victorian values that we've been talking about already, which considered women to be the property of men, and therefore that women would have the same status as men if they went through this enfranchisement process. Interesting that it would be called enfranchisement from one perspective, but certainly from an Indian perspective, this would be disenfranchising them. Right? It would be removing them from their political home, from their culture, from their language, from their ties to a particular territory. And you see the patrilineal nature of these changes. In 1869, there was further legislation passed. This is now after Confederation, and there was this idea of the act to encourage the gradual civilization of Indians continuing, but furthermore, Indian women were denied the right to vote in banned elections. Voting was now restricted to adult men, as it was in Canadian society more generally. When now an Indian woman married an Indian man from another band, she lost her membership in her home community. So someone from my community at Cape Croker would be married into, a woman would marry into the Wickwemicong community on Manitoulin Island. Her membership would then transfer to wherever her husband's Indian marriage was, marriage to another Indian. If she married a non-Indian, at this point, the Indian woman's status would be stripped. She would no longer be considered to have an Indian identity, and the children of her marriage would also not have identity as Indians, formally under the Indian Act. As all this was happening, and women were being stripped of identity as they married non-Indian men, if an Indian man married a non-Indian woman, that woman would gain status as an Indian. And so the status was flowing here in accordance with whether or not there was a man or a woman married. The results would lead to forcible ejectment of the woman from her community if she married a non-Indian man. And of course, that non-Indian man could not live in that place as well. Now, the explanation at the time was, well, these men who are non-Indian have designs on the lands of Indians, and therefore they're just using this loophole to be able to marry into a community and take up Indian lands. And so this, for some, was considered protection of Indian lands to allow this kind of distinction to occur. But if you read the records at the time, most communities were advocating otherwise. They didn't want women to lose status when they married non-Indian men. And you can read sort of file after file, letter after letter in this regard, including at Ganawage, which is the community that now has an issue where they still want to see, regardless of what the Indian Act says, if a person marries a non-Indian person, that the whole family has to leave the reserve. We're saying that today, but in the 1860s, 1870s, they were saying another thing, which is we want these people to continue to be a part of our community. So this continues on then. In the Indian Act, you get a consolidation of all the prior legislation, and then you get new provisions added. So I've mentioned before that the Indian Act is largely the act that controls most of life on the reserve, dealing with membership, property holding, political status, etc. And it's, like 100 and some odd years old. What is that, 100 and 150 years old almost. But it's older than that, because it actually goes back to 1850, or actually 1857, the kinds of provisions that the Indian Act tries to facilitate. The Indian Act itself kind of continues to replicate the idea of status only going through men and not women. And the interest of the band specifically here, Duncan Campbell Scott in the 1920s, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, says that when an Indian woman marries outside the band, whether a non-treaty Indian or a white man, it is in the interest of the department, and in her interest as well, to sever her connection wholly from the reserve and the Indian mode of life. The idea is that Indian life is inferior here. Why would she not want to be associated to the better society of the Victorian Canadians that were forming around Indians? And so this is explicit in terms of the idea of severance, and it's explicit in terms of the idea of assimilation of Indians. In 1951, you get some further amendments, and these amendments actually usually make things worse than better. You do have a replacement of blood as being the measure for status with a registration system, kind of a paper blood system. This registration system then determines your membership if you marry out for 2 generations. That is, if 2 generations of people marry non-Indians, that 3rd generation can no longer be Indian, even if they speak the language, participate in the culture, live in the community, are the grandchildren, aunts, uncles, cousins of everyone else that's associated with them there. There's an involuntary enfranchisement where you can just be deleted from the band lists as well. If you, say, get a law degree or go to university, you can be struck off the list because an Indian official could say you're too much non-Indian by virtue of your education, your participation in Canadian affairs. And this led to all sorts of unequal treatment. A lot of off-reserve children were enfranchised, created a huge imbalance again. And again, the women were the ones that repeatedly suffered the bulk of the negative effects of this intentional discrimination, exclusion from the lists. So that's the history of the Indian Act, and when I was born, this was what the world was like. Prior to 1985, there was a very heavy tilt towards women being asked to leave, because every 50% of marriages that Indians enter into are with non-Indians. Love really doesn't know nationality in many cases, and so when people fall in love and they get married, what occurs is their children could be statutorily, that is, women who fall in love with non-Indian men would find themselves being struck off the band list, and their children not being able to participate in the community. Because if you're not on the band list, you're non-Indian. Only Indians can live on reserve, and the band has a power under the Indian Act to be able to banish non-Indians. And so that banishment power of either the women who used to be Indians or the non-Indian men who are now married to these Indians is something that bands will use. They have so little powers of self-government, under the Indian Act anyway. This is one of those powers that they can use, so they use it. It's very troubling to me if this is one of the central sites of decision-making that communities can operate under, but there it is. So what you get is sometimes you get people not entering into formal marriages, and saying who the father is or the husband is. So the children can be born without a designation, and so therefore a presumption they tried to have enforced, which was, well, these people are therefore just regular Indians in that regard, because the women didn't lose their status, and therefore the child would not lose their status. So this law interfered with formalization, solemnization of marriage, registration of marriage, and then all the benefits that were accrued or associated with that in other parts of the society were lost to gain that one benefit of continuing to be able to be associated with marriage, with your community. In other words, this is my view now, the Indian Act isn't just racist and sexist. The Indian Act is actually anti-family. Right? It blows apart the most intimate relationships that you might want to form, particularly when they go across so-called racialized or ethnic lines, and particularly for women. They're the ones that face that consequence. So that's the background to what starts to occur with civil rights activism in the 1960s and 70s. And so in the 1960s and 70s, there's a Status of Women report. There was a Royal Commission on the status of women, and in its final report, it singled out for elimination the special kind of discrimination that results in Indian women's loss of status or enfranchisement. It singles out for critique what's been happening here in trying to assimilate Indian women and Indian communities more generally. On the heels of this Royal Commission on the status of women, you have two women that bring forth a case, Ms. Laval and Ms. Bedard. The facts here for Ms. Laval is she lives here on Manitoulin Island, Wickwemicombe, and she married a non-Indian man. And as a result, her name was deleted from the Indian registrar, and she became a persona designata under the Indian Act. Means she no longer had a right to live there, to be able to, own a house, take up residence. And for about 9 years, it seems, she was in this relationship, and then she divorced. And on divorce, she wanted to go back home. Right? She wanted to be with her family at Wickwemicombe. She wanted to have this loss of status be reinstated. So she went to the Ontario courts, and at trial, the question was whether or not the Section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act, which discriminates against Indian women and not Indian men. So the question is whether or not that discriminatory status under Section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act was contrary to Section 2 of the Canadian Bill of Rights, which forbids discrimination on the basis of race and discrimination on the basis of sex. She lost her case at trial. She succeeded in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal found that the Indian Act offends the right of Indian women to equality before the law under the Canadian Bill of Rights. So that's, as her case, is going up to the Supreme Court. It's then joined to another case, which also was flowing through the system in Ontario, of Ms. Bedard. She likewise lost her status when she married a non-Indian man. She was expelled from the community as a result, and ordered to dispose of her property. Her children were also expelled from the community. But then her marriage breaks down as well. And she wants to return back home to Six Nations this time, outside of Brantford, Ontario. And in the attempt to return home, she's got some advantage, she thinks, because her mother has passed on, and her mother has a will that gives her the property that her mother had to be able to live on. And that will was sanctioned also by the Department of Indian Affairs. So she starts living on this land of her mother's on the reserve, and the council of the band gives her permission for 6 months to be able to live on that land as a non-Indian. And then they extend that permission by another 6 months to be able to live on that land as a non-Indian. And then after a year, she recognizes that the council is going to kick her out. And so she conveys the land that her mother gave her to her brother. And then her brother lets her live on the land. And at that point, the band council speaks to the superintendent of Indian Affairs and asks for a quitclaim, asks for this woman to be ejected from the reserve. So here's the band wanting to eject a non-Indian, in one definition under the Indian Act, but a Six Nations woman, a Haudenosaunee woman, remember, clan mothers, matriarchal, matrilocal, matrilineal. This band is taking action to ensure that she does not live on the reserve, and the official from Indian Affairs refuses to administer that quit action, and so there's an action brought to consider the council's request to remove her from the community. And this goes to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and there's also a similar conclusion that this woman is facing discrimination under 12(1)B of the Indian Act that's contrary to the Canadian Bill of Rights. But notice the internalizations in here, right? It's not just that the Indian Affairs Department is doing this. In fact, in this instance, the Indian Affairs doesn't want to act to remove her, it's the band that wants to be able to remove her.
Do you not think that the reason that the bands act so properly according to the Indian Act is because when we were using our laws that were oral, it was very disrespectful not to observe laws. Mm-hmm. And so that would, underneath everything, that would be part of.
There's a lot of complications as to why the band might act like this. One is Indians want to be law-abiding, like other people want to be law-abiding. It's just that there's this confusion that's thrown into it, given that this law has been enacted in contrast to the other laws that continue to operate within the community. That's one reason. Another reason is there's a shortage of housing on reserves, and so if a person can be removed to meet other political demands who are actually voting Indians, right? This woman cannot vote in the elections anymore because she's not Indian, even though she's ethnically and culturally Six Nations. You're going to move that person in. That helps your maybe re-election chances there. That's a second reason. A third reason is the sexism that happens within communities. We should not overlook that and think that Indians would be immune from being sexist in that regard.
I'm not saying that in defense.
Yes.
I'm just trying to understand. Because as a female who was born in the 40s, these laws very much impacted my life.
Yeah. Shaped your life.
Oh, yes.
Generations of
yes.
people's lives. This is not just academic. It's the very thing that constructed you in the way you were relating to the world. And so here we've got this issue live before the courts here, which is Section 12(1)B of the Indian Act inoperative? due to Section 1B of the Canadian Bill of Rights. You can see the reason for reading the poems at the beginning, right? This is not a way to respectfully treat people, but yet we've got this just hardwired into the law. So with this question before them, the decision asks, again, is the Indian Act inoperative due to the Bill of Rights? The court comes to the conclusion that it is not. That, in other words, the Canadian Bill of Rights is not powerful enough to address this issue. It doesn't overturn the discrimination that's found in the Indian Act. In fact, the way the majority reads this provision is it finds it's not discriminatory. Why not? Well, the court says you need Section 9124 to effectively exercise. You need under Section 9124, when you've got authority for Indians and lands reserved for Indians, you need to be able to tell who the Indians are in order to follow through with that grant. So it's necessary for the implementation of authority so vested in the Parliament. Kind of ignores the fact that Indians could decide who are Indians, and then the Parliament could legislate in relationship to who the Indians say that they are. And that's kind of unheard of to even raise that issue at this point in the case. It's like the government has to decide who the Indians are so the government can exercise legislative authority in relationship to the Indians. There's this other case that Laval and Bedard tried to use by way of analogy to assist them, which is called dry bones. In the 1960s, the Indian Act also contained provisions that made it an offense to be able to consume alcohol off reserve for Indians. So Indians couldn't drink outside of the reserve. And often the Indian Act under the Indian agents didn't allow them to drink on reserve either. This was challenged as being discrimination on the basis of race, because we were both Indians at that time, and you were a non-Indian who went to a bar. Only you could be served. I couldn't be. I don't drink. So it would be a big deal at that point. But it's a big deal in terms of the racially people have that disqualification, and the court found that was contrary to the Bill of Rights. To distinguish between an Indian and non-Indian, give the Indian a punishment. The Indian doesn't get punished for drinking off the reserve. The court says it's a wholly different matter when we're just dealing with Indians. Right? This is a matter of external Indians relating to the world outside of the reserve. On the reserve, in their internal affairs, the court actually finds no distinction there. I think it's this next point. It's the dicey point here. The court makes the point, drawing from dicey, and I'll look at those other issues in a few seconds, that equality before the law means the equal subjection of all classes to the ordinary law of the land. The idea here is that equality under the Canadian Bill of Rights means the equal administration or application of the law by law enforcement authorities and by the ordinary courts of the land. All Indian women are treated equally because all Indian women lose their status in accordance with these provisions. So there's no favoritism that is being exercised by administrators. There's no inequality that's being exercised by the ordinary courts of the land. They're just administering sameness in the law. And therefore, equality before the law means in this Diceian concept that because all Indian women equally lose their status, there's no discrimination because that's equal. Now, they're not comparing Indian men and Indian women. They're just comparing all Indian women being treated the same there, which leaves itself. They say this was the intent of the Indian Act was also the intent of the Bill of Rights to be read in such a way to, as much as possible, preserve the will of Parliament. They say we should construe any piece of legislation like the Indian Act so as not to infringe the Canadian Bill of Rights. The court makes the point, this is not the egalitarian context of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Sorry, could you just remind me what year this case was decided in?
Yeah, 1973.
Because part of my question is, and I understand that this is somewhat separated from the issue, is how much kind of prevalent ideas around feminism and the role of women just in society in general impacted that?
So, a lot. The Royal Commission for the Status of Women introduced an idea of equality that was more substantive as opposed to equality as sameness. And there was hope with the Dry Bones case that that substantive equality would continue to expand. But then along came the Lavelle case and it shut the door on that. And so because of this case, you get the National Association for the Status of Women, other feminist and indigenous women's groups motivated to change. One of the reasons we have Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as we do, is because of the Lavelle and Bedard case. A recognition that statute alone wouldn't change inequalities in the land. Not only did Indians, when they participated the little that they did in constitutional debates, hook onto this point, but by and large, the feminist community, women's activists really use this as the prime motivator for saying we need to constitutionalize equality. It's just not acceptable. And there was a strong dissent that said Dry Bones is analogous to the circumstances here with the loss of status. One, because there was a statutory intent for the Bill of Rights to have a broad application to deal with, this kind of discrimination like you find in the Indian Act. And the court also says, you just take the word race out of Dry Bones and put the word sex in, and you've got the same kind of discrimination there. They also give a rejoinder to Section 9124. A member of the court in the majority said, you need to make distinctions under Indians, because that's just inherent in the grant of authority. Page 829, the dissent says, the second paragraph there, discriminatory treatment on the basis of race or color or sex does not adhere in the grant of legislative power. So you have the ability to be able to deal with Indians, the dissent says, and this is Justice Laskin, Chief Justice Laskin. You have the ability to deal with Indians, but it doesn't mean you have the ability to discriminate against them, just because 9124 sets out your constitutional authority. So it's a huge loss for Lavelle and Bedard. It's a huge loss for those who wanted to see equality advance more generally under the Canadian Bill of Rights. It does eventually lead to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Why is the focus of the majority decision so much on race? Like, why does it matter if all Aboriginal women are treated the same if all Aboriginal women are treated differently than Aboriginal men? Like, that seems very clear. The divide is sex, not
Yes, it
race.
seems very clear to the dissent here. So why is the majority taking this position? I think it's parliamentary sovereignty and deference to the will of the people through the majority there. This is why the Bill of Rights was cut down, is there was a hesitancy on the part of the judiciary to question Parliament. We have a different view of this after 1982 because there's explicit permission now for that to occur, but the judges struggled before that time, and so they tried to construe narrowly the Bill of Rights, just regarding as an ordinary statute, because the Parliament was still supreme. what's sad about this, just going to what Barbara was talking about earlier, this could have been fixed in 1973. Right? People live another 10, 20, 30, 40 years and find that this still is grinding in their lives. So there's now a desire to take this to an international forum because of the defeat in the national forum. And so out of the Tobique Reserve comes this application to the Human Rights Committee under Article 4.1 of the Optional Protocol of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the facts of the case here are that Ms. Lovelace was married for about 6 or 7 years, was disenfranchised from her community as a result of that marriage, and couldn't hold property, couldn't reside there, etc. Then her marriage, like these other women, breaks down, and she seeks to return to the reserve, but is prevented from doing so because the Indian Act prevails over the Canadian Bill of Rights, any other action. So the issues are under this International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, RP there, reverse, whether or not there's discrimination on the basis of sex that she's facing that's contrary to Canada's entering into that international covenant, or whether or not there's discrimination on the basis of her minority culture. And the court's going to find, I keep saying court, I mean commission. The commission is going to find that they can't rule on the issue of sexual discrimination, whether or not the Indian Act is contrary to the optional protocol and the international civil and political rights. But they are going to find that it's contrary to her ability to associate with her culture. So there's discrimination on the basis of culture in the case is where the court's going. So that's the facts, that's the issue. Canada's argument against Lovelace, against women that are similarly situated to her, those who have lost status through marrying non-Indian men, is that it's necessary, just like in the Bill of Rights case, it's necessary under 9124 to define who Indians are. Communities, they say, are traditionally patrilineal, and this provision is a protection against non-Indian men coming in and taking these Indian women's property. And they say, yes, we realize that reform is needed, but there's going to be a huge process of consultation that needs to occur to allow this change to happen. And until it does, hands off, Human Rights Committee, we are exercising our constitutionally designated authority here. Her arguments are that she disputes that Indian communities are traditionally patrilineal. Now, this is still a debate in some Algonquin communities, and whether or not you can pass your clan or your Dodan through the male or the female line. There's a case I didn't have you read, but if you want to read something that's just outrageous, read the next case after the readings today, the Sawridge case. It sort of pulls out those problems. She also says, look at the statistics. There are so many women that are losing status over this long period of time that it demonstrates both sexual discrimination. It falls, the adverse impacts fall most heavily on women, as well as the cultural impacts. And they talk about the consequences of loss of status. And here on paragraph 9, 832 of the materials, here's some of those consequences. If you're no longer an Indian, you can't possess lands on a reserve. You can't reside on lands on a reserve. You can't receive possessory interests from parents or others on a reserve. You can't receive any loans from the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the purposes that are set out in the Indian Act, so economic development, social kinds of loans. These might seem less problematic now, but you can't receive instruction for farming. You can't receive benefit for medical treatment under health services. It's a part of some of the Indian Act provisions. There's no ability to receive tax-exempt status when you reside on Indian Reserve lands. You can't borrow money for houses on the lands. You can't cut timber. You can't hunt there. And you lose the cultural benefits of living in an Indian community, the emotional ties of home, family, friends, and neighbors, and the loss of identity. So this is what she says is arguing for the provision being found contrary to the international human rights instruments. And the court's going to accept her arguments there in relationship to the consequences of the loss for her culturally speaking. So she loses on the Article 2 issue, she wins on the Article 27 issue. She loses on the grounds of sexual discrimination, she wins on the grounds of she's being denied right to participate with her minority culture. Questions or comments about that? So this commission is different than a court, right? They have no binding authority on Canada. Their only chance for having their decisions gaining force is their persuasiveness of their opinions. So why did they choose not to go on the grounds of sex and therefore go on the grounds of cultural status? Your guess is as good as mine. The commission did say, we can't consider this issue on the grounds of sex because these provisions denying women status under the Indian Act were in force prior to the optional protocol coming into effect, the ICCPR. And the ICCPR can only apply to laws that are passed after the date of it coming into effect. And that discrimination on the basis of sex occurred before it came into force. So they don't want to deal with those aspects unless there's continuing discrimination. Of course, there is continued discrimination on the basis of sex, but they just don't want to deal with it. I don't know why. But they do find on the cultural grounds that yes, that was there before the Act came into force, the protocol came into force thereafter, the protocol came into force, and therefore, because this woman is denied these emotional bonds, it's a major loss to a person ceasing to be an Indian. It's the loss of these cultural benefits of living in the community, the emotional ties to home, family, friends, and neighbors, and the loss of identity. So therefore, she's been denied, and here's the wording of the article, 27. In those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, like Canada, like Indians, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, and to use their own language. This is what she's being denied, contrary to that Article 27. Okay. I'm glad they focus on the emotional side of this. That seems to have been lost in most everything that we've talked about up until this place, as if it was a benefit for Indians to gain status through marrying up, not recognizing that detriment. Imagine if you could just no longer ever live with your parents, right? And you couldn't live in their town and associate with that place you grew up with, all the things that are familiar to you, that cultural space. You were just statutorily denied to be able to participate in your family's activity in that place anymore because you're a woman. And then, of course, Indian men, who are the children, as well as women, who are the children that also have that excommunication.
So does that apply to individuals that had to move back home, say, to look after elderly parents?
Yes, it applies to those people as well. If you are like one of these, like if Mrs. Laval, Bedard, or Lovelace had elderly parents who were sick, you would be forbidden from going home and looking after them and taking care of them. This is anti-family, it's sexist, it's emotionally damaging.
It was really difficult to live outside of the reserve and not be able to go and gather food in the spring when all the women were going out to gather food. And also, you couldn't take part in things such as feasts on reserve. And you couldn't be buried with your family. You'd have to go somewhere else, or you'd be put somewhere else.
Couldn't be buried with your family. You couldn't participate in the feasts. You couldn't participate in the food, the gathering, the life, the celebrations of the community, the kinds of poetry that I was reading. You couldn't feel the poetry of life.
I guess I'm kind of all over the place here. But I think it varies. I guess I'm kind of thinking about Alberta specifically, but would there be other factors with like a nation electing to pursue to kick somebody off reserve? Like if somebody's living over by, like say, the dump or undesirable property, something like that, nobody cares kind of thing.
Yeah.
If somebody has like beautiful waterfront property, oh look, there's a technicality, we can get that, or
Yes.
maybe they act and cheat or somebody can get that. Is that a factor?
So this is a factor. We're going to talk about reinstatement in a second for some of these women, and there was a resistance on the part of some communities to have these women come back home, because there's an internalization now of 150 years of thinking about the world being organized in this way. And sometimes that resistance occurred because we don't have enough housing, resources to be able to receive you back home. You're going to just impose a hardship on us by you coming home like that, ignoring all the other things that aren't hardship when you combine together as family. But sometimes it went the other direction. We are an oil-rich community. We have millions and billions of dollars of money. We don't want you coming home to dilute the share of that wealth. We want to be good stewards. We want to hold our capital in that smaller group. And so therefore you're not welcome home. And you made your choice. You elected when you married out to participate in another way of being. And in the United States right now, with some of the rich casino tribes, you see these membership battles going on. This is a very important point you're bringing up. Sometimes if you don't have enough, this can occur. Sometimes if you have a lot, this kind of discrimination could also occur by the community holding people out. And so obviously a lot of women put a lot of action and heart into trying to change this, as you saw with Laval and Bedard, and now Ms. Lovelace and her community, and in the materials, and this Enough is Enough retrospective, there's a reporting on their activism. It gives an insight into the women's view of tradition, which is not one that would cut people off just if they got married to someone they love that happened to be non-Maliseet or isn't a Mi'kmaq person. They say, and they talked about the power of definition lies within us as Native women and as our community more generally. Why are we giving the Indian Act, why are we giving Parliament the authority to say who we are? It should be something that resides within our family. But they make the point that Indian people, a lot of men, were reinforcing this discrimination amongst themselves. There was these views as white women married in, as they called them. There's an exclusionary attitudes towards them as well. I'm troubled by this. Troubled by the discrimination that goes all over the place here. I support their activism and what they're trying to accomplish here, but why do these men who are Indian, who have married non-Indian women, why do those women have to be excluded in the process, or why can't they be a part of the community just as others? If it's not based on race, which it should not be, if it's based on family, if it's based on the language, the culture, as we saw in Article 27 of the optional protocol, if it's based on the political status, a nation idea, why are they talking about white women in that way? But nevertheless, that's what it is. They have a pessimistic view of self-determination as a result. Because of the way these men are acting, when they've got these positions of authority in councils, why do we want self-government if all self-government is going to do is replicate these discriminatory patterns that we think aren't a part of our tradition? They use housing as a focus of protest, and the Native Women's Association of Canada brings this also forward as a point of action in their advocacy around the patriation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it comes in three ways. First of all, they're supporting Section 28 of the Charter, which is the gender equality provisions. They also support the eventual addition to Section 35(1) of the Constitution, which is Section 35(4), which is the Aboriginal treaty rights guaranteed in Section 1 apply equally to male and female persons. So there's no excuse, constitutionally speaking, for Indians to use self-determination to discriminate on the basis of sex. Now that could be a problem for some communities who are matriarchal, matrilocal, matrilineal. They lose that opportunity now to carry that side forward of their tradition. But they also lose the opportunity for those that are sexist to be able to say, well, patrilineal was always the way we did things, or it's okay that women don't have the same kind of participation.
I think sort of links to what you were talking about, yes, the other clause, but if there's, in section 15, there's if it's an ameliorative purpose, it doesn't matter if it's discriminatory. Why is that not built into section 35?
Yes, that's a good point. You could have built in a section 35(5), which is, you know, as we're applying, applies equally to male and female persons. If there's an ameliorative purpose, you know, reading substantive equality into section 35(4) could have been helpful there. They didn't. Maybe it's there though, like the law case, maybe you might find it. That is the section 15 case kind of stuff gets read into section 35(4). But great question. But the point I'm trying to make more generally here is that the law didn't just change by Parliament waking up one morning and say, oh, I've got a good idea. Let's stop discriminating against these Indian women, right? It's like all these years of activism, both in the courts, internationally speaking, and on the ground, and in Indigenous women's organizations. And we've seen recently through the Idle No More movement, this kind of way of acting. Again, law is also customary. Law does flow from people. It flows from you and I, not just those who are separated apart in an elected or judicial office. Now, of course, you know, complications in that, but it's important in this context. So there were legislative reforms. Between 1982 and 1985, as you know, the equality rights provisions weren't in force. It was only after April 17th, I think, 1985, that you could bring an action to be able to challenge some piece of government legislation on the basis that it discriminated under one of those heads. And so what happened is, because of that provision going to come into effect on April 17th, and all of this activism, the Parliament amended the Indian Act to restore status to those women who lost it under Section 12(1)(b), and to allow the children of that union under 12(1)(b) also to regain status. You can see the effect of the Charter, because when that Indian Act was amended, it was made sort of retroactive to April 17th, 1985. They knew that they were going to be challenged as acting contrary to the Charter if they didn't amend the Indian Act. So, don't ever let anyone can say that the charter itself didn't have an effect on Indian issues and status, because here it did. It wasn't the only thing. It's coupled with activism. It's coupled with international law. And so the Bill C-35-1 provisions come into effect. I think I've already mentioned them, which is those who were disenfranchised gain back status as well as their children. The impact is you get 133,000 people being restored to status in 1985. So the Indian status population grows between 1985 and 1996 by 19%. And about 60%, 57.2% of those people restored to status are women. So who are those 40% males? Those are the children of those women who lost their status. But there was residual discrimination. There's this Joan and John example in the text. I'll just read it. It's on page 842. This is found in the report of the Aboriginal Justice Inquirer of Manitoba. John and Joan, brother and sister, were both registered Indians. Joan married a Métis man before 1985, so she lost her Indian status under 12(1)(b) of the former act. John married a white woman before 1985, and she automatically became a status Indian. So partners are treated differently. Both John and Joan have children over the years. Joan is now eligible to regain her status under Section 1C, and her children will qualify under Section 2. They are treated as having only one eligible parent, their mother, although both parents are Aboriginal. John's children gained status at birth as both parents were legally Indian, even though only one was an Aboriginal person. Joan's children can pass on status to their offspring only if they also marry registered Indians. If they married unregistered Aboriginal peoples, then no status will pass to their children. But all of John's grandchildren will be status Indians regardless of who the children married. Thus, entitlement to registration for the second generation has nothing to do with racial or cultural characteristics. The Act has eliminated the discrimination faced by those who lost status, but they passed it on to the next generation. So here's the example of John and Mary and the children. This child has 6-1 status because he married a non-Indian woman, but she became Indian. This child has 6-2 status because she married a Métis person, and they both were considered non-Indian. And so this person's born with 6-2 status, the grandchild of John. The grandchild of Mary doesn't have any status. And so this is what the Mciver case challenges, is not only this discrimination under this one category, but all discrimination through the generations that women have faced. Now there's the proposed amendments, which eventually are going to be ratified by the Court of Appeal in the Mciver case, which allows this child to be able to pass on status to their children. Still a 2-generation cutoff. Still, if you marry out for 2 generations, you lose status. Again, if you've got an elderly parent to care for, the grandchild can't go back to the grandmother and live on the reserve. The councils can be quite aggressive in kicking you out if they
I
want
think, regardless of how it happens, the bottom line is it's all about getting rid of the Indian status title
That's right.
and making us the same as everybody else, regardless of our customs and culture.
So at Mciver, that the trial court would have given a larger group of people entitlement to status. If there's any lineal descent from a woman who's lost status, you can gain this ability to be able to associate with the community. Not in these roles, but the point you're making is more important, it's more generally applicable. Again, 50% of Indians marry non-Indians. You do the math, through 2 generations. The 3rd generation will be technically no Indians. So we have a beautiful reserve at Cape Croker, but if we continue to marry out in the way that we marry out, we might have treaty rights, we might have hunting, fishing rights, we might have other kinds of things that we gain. Chilcotin wins Aboriginal title. But if these rules continue to operate, in 100 years there'll be no Chilcotin that can claim Indian status to be able to occupy those lands.
I mean, this stuff confuses me quite a bit. Is there like kind of a, like I'm trying to figure out, is there like a practical reason why this makes sense in terms of just like, you know, dealing with situations that arise, or is it kind of like, does it still seem like there's something really like, it's not practical, it's actually just, you know, trying to see.
It's only practical in the extent that they're trying to make this child equal to this child, which is to ensure that they both can have status and it's not differentiated on the basis of who these people married. It makes sense in that way, but it actually doesn't make sense from a policy point of view, because you're still tearing apart Indian communities. You just moved you just cleaned it up for another generation, but you know, in your children's generation, that's going to be an issue that comes back again. Someone's going to be standing up, unless you know this justice minister or someone does something soon. Someone's going to be standing here in 20 years, making these same kind of arguments, just like someone was maybe standing here 40 years ago talking about Lovelace.
Is there, from the government's point of view, some sort of floodgates argument here that if you didn't draw the lines, there's a necessity and
Yep.
we have to draw the line somewhere, otherwise we'll have obligations and duties to a
Yeah.
huge number of...
That's right. There's that floodgates argument. There are those rights for, and they're very limited, but there's, you know, you can get glasses, you get some rudimentary teeth, like healthcare stuff, if you're an Indian. You can get a loan for a house on the reserve, almost. I mean, it's not a lot, but that's the kind of floodgates things that people are concerned about. And then there's just kind of the emotional floodgates of, we're going to grow the Indian population like that and allow people to become Indians. That cuts against the grain of where our entire history has been flowing, which is try to narrow and assimilate and get rid of this distinctive class.
But if you look at the Indian Act and you look at the other side of the benefits, you know, and I'll just talk about what I've learned.
Yeah.
When I was a little girl, dentists did or didn't come to reserves. Okay, moot point. When I went to residential school, the dentist came and he was paid on the basis of the number of teeth he extracted from a mouth. So, what do you think the bottom line was? And then if you look at housing, and I'm writing about this right now on a paper that I'm doing for my part of this course. You have to give up title to your house until the last penny is paid. And if you get a mortgage at all, and that you have to have a job, everything else that everybody else in this room has to have, I have to have. But I also, it takes me a year to get a mortgage. And I have to get an okay from the Minister of CMHC, whoever that is. And Indian Act, or the Minister of Indian Affairs has to personally sign my mortgage, even though I qualify. You know, so the things that are put on us
there's
as,
a whole,
as First Nations
that's right.
are
There's a
behind
whole
this.
other layer of bureaucracy, which is just one way of simplifying this, but
Yeah,
there's that, but then it's also so paternalistic and racist. It's not just like bureaucracy as a neutral term of technocratic. It's like an oversight and a second questioning and guessing up. And that story about teeth, you know, you grew up on the West Coast. My mom grew up in Ontario on Georgian Bay. That dentist, not that dentist, but the dentist came in, same thing. They get paid on the basis of how many, so what that person used to do is used to put, like, I don't know what it was, wasn't mud or clay, but the fillings were so brittle and fragile they would last for about a year, and then they would have to go back and have to fill the cavity again. So this person had an ongoing line of work because of the inferior quality of what he used. He'd always be able to count on going to the Indian Reserve. And so my mom tells this story, like, here's this young, trusting 8-10-year-old sitting on a dentist chair with your mouth open, expecting, you know, good healthcare treatment, and the violation of trust, the violation of her human body that took place through that. And that's, of course, just one type of violation of the human body that has taken place through residential schools in India and ACT through the years. It is outrageous. It is atrocious to think of this, you know, here we are separated by thousands of miles, and you tell a story similar to what my mother tells in what's received there. Mciver, as we've already talked about, tries to do this. You then get this section, Bill C3, Gender Equality, Gender Equity in Indian Registration, which reinstates those children of those women, children who lost status. And this is on the course space you can look at. There's different ways of passing along status. So you might be dating and think, are you 6'1"? Are you 6'2"? Right? And kind of fishing around. Sounds funny. It is, right? But it's also partially true, right? People are continuing to still be driven by these extraneous factors if they want their children to be with their grandparents. If you want to live in that place and speak your language and participate in feasts and, you know, just do what we would expect would be normal for humans to do. We don't have time to watch this. Please watch this now with the context of understanding you have. This does the internal side. It's not just all Parliament's problem anymore. We live with this, as so much of us, so many of us have also internally digested this. Friday, we're meeting, I think it's at 12, but I'll send out a note to talk about Aboriginal women in our